Cowboy saw Apache struck before the crowd, and the lantern that fell exposed the truth. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Luke Thompson was a cowboy who lived a quiet life on the edge of a small, dusty town. His days were filled with the hard, honest work of maintaining his ranch, but he never got involved with the people around him. The town itself was a place of old grudges, rumors, and gossip, a world Luke preferred to avoid. He wasn't interested in the noise of the community, or the politics of the lawmen who kept order by force. For years, he had lived in solitude, enjoying the peace that came with his isolation. It was a simple life, yet it was one that allowed him to stay out of trouble. But that peace would be shattered one afternoon when he rode into town for supplies. The market square was crowded, as it often was, with the clatter of wagons, the rattle of horses' hooves, and the hum of conversation. But today, the scene was different. There was an air of tension, an uneasy silence that hung over the crowd like a storm cloud. Luke noticed a circle of people gathered in the middle of the square, their faces grim and eyes focused on something in the center. His curiosity piqued, Luke urged his horse closer, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. And that's when he saw her. An Apache woman, no older than him, her dark hair falling loosely around her face, was standing at the center of the crowd. Her hands were bound behind her back, and there was a rope tied around her neck, holding her in place. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, the voices filled with venom and disdain. She had been accused of something terrible, though no one seemed to know exactly what. The people had already made up their minds. She was guilty in their eyes, and no one dared question it. Luke's heart clenched as he watched her. Her eyes were downcast, her face hidden in shame, but there was something in her posture that struck him. It was not the shame of a criminal. It was the resignation of someone who had been wronged, someone who knew they could not change the minds of the crowd. Luke felt a tug in his chest. He wasn't sure why, but something about her made him want to step forward, to do something, to make the injustice stop. But before he could move, he saw the man in charge. Sheriff Bradley, the local lawman, stood at the front of the crowd, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, ready to act at any moment. The situation felt wrong to Luke, but he wasn't sure what he could do to stop it. Just then, the crowd fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the center. A lantern, hanging from a nearby post, swayed in the wind, casting flickering light across the square. The lantern fell, hitting the ground with a soft thud. The crowd gasped. The sound seemed to trigger something in Luke, a sudden sense of clarity. He knew, in that moment, that the truth was not what everyone had assumed. Something in the air shifted, and Luke could see that the Apache woman's eyes had lifted, her gaze meeting his. The light of the lantern had revealed something else, something he wasn't expecting. Luke's instincts screamed at him to act. He wasn't sure what he could do, but the truth had to come out. The crowd was still, their attention fully on the woman and the unexpected twist that the falling lantern had caused. As the silence stretched on, Luke stepped forward, his voice steady and clear. He called out, demanding that they let the woman go. And as the lantern's light flickered one last time, revealing a part of the story no one had been willing to see, Luke knew that he would do whatever it took to ensure justice was served. The crowd was still, their eyes fixed on Luke, waiting for him to make his move. He stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what to do next. But there was no time to waste. The Apache woman's fate hung in the balance, and Luke knew that if he didn't act now, it could be too late. He stepped forward, the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy coat. The sheriff, Bradley, looked up at him, a mix of surprise and irritation flashing across his face. "What's this, Luke? You think you can change what's already decided?" The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Luke didn't flinch. "She's innocent," he said, his voice steady but firm. The crowd murmured, the tension in the square rising. Luke could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, some filled with anger, others with uncertainty. But all were waiting for someone to make the next move. Luke didn't care about the crowd, about the whispers or the judgment. He had seen something in the Apache woman's eyes, something that told him she was no threat. He had seen the truth in her gaze, and it was all that mattered now. The sheriff scoffed, clearly frustrated with Luke's interruption. Innocent? This woman's people have been raiding our settlements for years, and now you want to stand here and defend her? Luke's jaw clenched. You've been told lies. She didn't do anything wrong. The sheriff's face reddened. You don't know anything about her. You're just as naive as the rest of them. Luke took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. He wasn't sure how to convince the sheriff, but he had to try. I know enough. I know that she doesn't deserve to die for something she didn't do. The sheriff looked ready to argue, but before he could speak, the Apache woman, who had been standing silently, spoke up. Her voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that made everyone pause. I didn't do anything, she said softly. I'm not who they say I am. The words were simple, but they cut through the tension in the air like a knife. The sheriff hesitated, his gaze flicking between Luke and the woman. The crowd fell silent. For a moment, it seemed as if the world had stopped turning. Luke could see the doubt creeping into the sheriff's eyes, but it wasn't enough. He needed more than doubt. He needed the truth to be exposed, and he needed the crowd to see it. Just then, the lantern that had fallen earlier flared back to life, casting a soft glow across the square. The light revealed something unexpected. On the woman's wrist there was a small bracelet, one that Luke recognized. It was the same bracelet that had belonged to his mother, a gift from her childhood. The realization hit Luke like a thunderclap. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the bracelet. That bracelet, he said, his voice low but full of recognition. It's mine. The crowd gasped, and the sheriff turned sharply to face Luke. What are you talking about? Luke reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the bracelet. My mother had one just like it. She told me stories about it when I was a boy. It was from her time with the Apache. The Apache woman's eyes widened in surprise, and she took a step forward. Your mother? She asked, her voice soft with curiosity. Luke nodded. My mother was raised by the Apache, and I've heard the stories. She told me about a time when they saved her life. She gave me this bracelet as a reminder. The sheriff looked confused, and the crowd was beginning to murmur again. Luke could see the change in their faces as they processed what he had just revealed. The Apache woman stepped closer, her face now full of recognition. Your mother, she whispered. She was one of us. Luke's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the bracelet. It was the way she had said it, the way her words seemed to reach across time and space. It was the truth, and it was right in front of him. The sheriff stood still, unsure of how to react. The crowd was beginning to shift, their judgment clouded by the new information. The Apache woman looked at Luke with a mixture of hope and gratitude. You don't have to fight for me, she said softly. But I know you'll fight for the truth. The words settled in Luke's chest like a weight that had been lifted. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about saving her now. It was about saving everything his mother had stood for, everything she had taught him. The sheriff remained silent, the anger in his eyes replaced by something else, something that almost looked like regret. The crowd, too, had fallen silent, waiting for the next move. Luke stood tall, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't going to let this woman die. Not today. Not when. The truth was finally out. The truth had been revealed, and it was time for justice to be done. The crowd stood in stunned silence, the weight of Luke's words lingering in the air. No one knew what to say or what to do next. The Apache woman's gaze remained steady on Luke, as if searching for something, a final confirmation of the truth that had just been revealed. Luke's mind raced, but his body remained still. The world around him felt like it was slowing down, as if time itself was holding its breath. The sheriff's eyes darted between Luke and the woman, clearly unsure how to proceed. His hand was still resting near his gun, but there was no urgency in his movements anymore. He seemed frozen, caught between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the growing realization that everything he had known might be wrong. I don't know what to say," Sheriff Bradley muttered, his voice shaky. "I never—" He trailed off, his words lost in the quiet that had descended on the square. Luke didn't move, but his eyes never left the sheriff. He knew the sheriff was conflicted, unsure how to deal with this unexpected turn of events. The Apache woman had given him no reason to distrust her. In fact, everything about her demeanor said she was not a threat. She had been wrong, just as Luke had been wronged all those years ago. He looked at her, his voice calm but filled with determination. "You owe her an apology," he said, his words directed at the sheriff. "And you owe her more than that. You owe her justice." The sheriff hesitated, his face reddening in the heat of the moment. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped, as if the words were stuck in his throat. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sheriff spoke, his voice quieter now. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavy with reluctance. "But I'm afraid it's too late for her." Luke's heart sank, but he didn't let the sheriff's words deter him. He could see the truth in the woman's eyes, and he knew that justice couldn't wait any longer. "It's never too late," Luke said, his voice rising slightly. "You've been given the chance to make things right. Don't let her die for something she didn't do." The crowd remained still, waiting for something to break the silence. The Apache woman stepped forward, her posture calm yet strong. She didn't speak immediately, but her eyes locked onto Luke's, and for a brief moment, there was a shared understanding between them. Then, in a quiet, measured voice, she said, "It's enough." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Luke's chest tighten. She had no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance of the situation. Luke nodded, understanding what she meant. She wasn't asking for vengeance or anger. She was asking for the truth to be acknowledged. The sheriff seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. He shifted uncomfortably, then sighed. "I don't know what's come over me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been blinded by my own beliefs." He looked down at the ground, his hands trembling slightly. "I'll make this right." Luke stood tall, but the tension in his body eased slightly. The sheriff had taken the first step toward redemption, and now it was up to the people of the town to follow his lead. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring to each other, their earlier hostility replaced with uncertainty and a hint of remorse. The sheriff approached the Apache woman, his face drawn and weary. He stood before her, his eyes no longer filled with arrogance, but with a quiet apology. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice softer this time. "I never should have treated you like this." The woman nodded, accepting his apology without a word. She had not expected more from him, and in some ways, the apology was all she needed. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice. It was about being seen, being heard, and being understood. Luke watched the scene unfold before him. He had done what he could. He had stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The truth had been exposed, and justice, however imperfect, had been served. As the sheriff and the Apache woman exchanged a final, silent nod, Luke turned to leave. His work here was done. He had no need for accolades, no need for thanks. His mission had always been clear, to ensure that truth and justice prevailed. He had fought for what was right, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet town. Luke stood outside the saloon, leaning against the wooden post, his thoughts drifting as the events of the day replayed in his mind. The tension, the confrontation, the moment of truth, all of it had unfolded so quickly, yet it felt like it had taken a lifetime. As he looked around, the streets seemed eerily calm. The crowd had gone, their murmurs fading into the evening air, but Luke felt a heaviness in his chest that wouldn't lift. He had done the right thing, he told himself. But there was still a gnawing uncertainty deep inside. Would things truly change? Or would the town return to the way it had always been, stuck in its old ways, clinging to its prejudices? He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. The day had been a turning point, but he knew that one act of justice, no matter how profound, would not change the hearts of everyone. The sheriff had apologized, yes, but there would always be those who would remain silent, complicit in the darkness of the town's undercurrent of hate. A voice broke through his thoughts, and Luke turned to see the Apache woman approaching him. Her movements were slow but purposeful, the steady rhythm of her steps cutting through the stillness of the town. Luke straightened up, his hand instinctively reaching for his hat as he tipped it toward her. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Luke nodded, but there was no need for words. He had done what he could, and she knew it. The quiet exchange of gratitude was enough. She stopped a few feet in front of him, her gaze meeting his. "You don't know how much this means to me," she continued, her eyes softening. "You've given me something I never thought I would have, my life, my dignity." Luke felt the weight of her words, and for a moment, it seemed as though the world had fallen away. There was no more judgment, no more prejudice, just two people standing in the fading light, connected by a shared moment of truth. "I didn't do it for you," Luke said, his voice low, almost to himself. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. No one deserves to be treated like that." The Apache woman smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth curling just enough to show a glimmer of warmth. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but there are very few who would have stepped forward. Very few who would have cared." Luke shifted his weight, his boots grinding softly against the dirt. "You deserve better than this town. Than this life they tried to make for you." She nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. But then her expression darkened, just slightly, as if the weight of something unspoken hung in the air. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. "I cannot stay here, even with the truth out. This place is broken, and I can't change it." Luke's heart sank. He had hoped she would stay, hoped that the events of the day might spark some kind of change, even if it was small. But he understood. She had seen too much, endured too much, and this town would never truly welcome her. "Where will you go?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back to the hills," she replied. "Back to my people." There was a finality in her words that made Luke's chest tighten. She wasn't looking for a future in this town. Her future lay elsewhere, among her own. "I understand," Luke said, though the words didn't seem to carry the weight he wanted them to. The Apache woman gave him one last look, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for everything," she said. "And for showing me that there is still some good in this world." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight, her figure slowly fading into the darkness. Luke watched her go, the silence of the town swallowing her up. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the desert, the promise of change, but also the harsh reality that some things could never be fixed. As the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, Luke stood there, lost in thought. The day had changed him, but it had also reminded him of the vast divide that still existed between people, between their worlds. Some battles were won, but others, he feared, would never truly end. He took one last look at the empty street, then turned and walked toward his ranch. The world was quiet now, but Luke knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, and the unshakable weight of the truth would continue to echo in his mind. But for tonight, at least, the quiet was all he needed. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows over the vast expanse of Luke's ranch. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and fresh earth lingering in the cool breeze. Luke stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the land he had worked for so many years. His thoughts were heavy, the events of the past few days weighing on him. He had done what he could, he told himself, but there was still a feeling of unfinished business. The Apache woman, Ayanna, was gone now, heading back to her people. He had hoped she would stay, hoped that perhaps the town would finally begin to change. But he knew better. Change didn't come easy. Not in this place. Not when the roots of hatred and fear ran so deep. As Luke stood there, lost in his thoughts, he heard the sound of hooves approaching from behind him. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he saw a lone rider making their way toward him. The figure on horseback was tall, their silhouette sharp against the rising sun. It was Sheriff Bradley, looking as worn and weary as Luke felt. The sheriff dismounted and approached Luke, his expression grim. Luke nodded, acknowledging his presence, but said nothing. For a moment, there was silence between them, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Finally, Sheriff Bradley spoke. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, his voice low and sincere. "For what you did yesterday. I wasn't sure at first, but I see now I was wrong." Luke didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out over the land once more, the words hanging in the air. The sheriff was standing just a few feet away now, waiting for Luke to speak. "I did it because it was the right thing to do," Luke finally said, his voice steady but not without emotion. "She didn't deserve what happened to her." The sheriff nodded, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "You're right," he said. "She didn't. And neither did you. I know now that I've been blind to a lot of things. But I'm not blind anymore." Luke could hear the sincerity in the sheriff's voice, but it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. The town would always remember the wrongs that had been done, no matter how much they tried to make things right now. "I can't change the past," Luke said, his voice quieter now. "None of us can. But maybe, just maybe, we can start doing better." The sheriff looked down at the ground, his expression hardening. "I know I can. But can the rest of the town?" Luke didn't answer. He didn't know the answer to that question. It was something that would take time, something that couldn't be fixed in a day. But there was hope, however small, that maybe things would get better. Sheriff Bradley seemed to read Luke's thoughts. "I've already made some calls," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to make sure she's not forgotten. I'll make sure this town remembers." Luke looked at him, surprised. "You really mean it?" The sheriff gave a small nod. "Yeah. I do." For a moment, there was a flicker of hope in Luke's chest. Maybe things could change after all. Maybe this wasn't just another broken town filled with broken people. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. The sheriff seemed to sense Luke's shift in mood, and he clapped him on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Luke," he said. "And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Luke nodded, his thoughts racing. As the sheriff mounted his horse and rode off, Luke stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon. The world around him was still, but inside, something had shifted. The past could never be undone, but the future? That was still up to them. The sun was higher now, the warmth of the day starting to spread across the land. Luke turned toward his ranch, his steps slow but steady. The day was just beginning, and with it came new possibilities, new challenges. It wasn't going to be easy, but Luke was ready. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't walking it alone. Days passed, and the small town of Dusty Hollow began to feel a subtle shift. People spoke in hushed tones about what had happened, some with shame in their voices, others with a growing sense of understanding. Luke Thompson, once just another lonely cowboy on the outskirts, had become a figure of quiet strength in the town. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't need it. But the town was changing, albeit slowly, and Luke couldn't help but notice the difference in the way people looked at him now. The harsh stares, the whispered judgments, had softened. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and for the first time, the truth was out in the open. He had done what he could to expose it, but now the responsibility lay with the people of Dusty Hollow to decide whether they would embrace that truth or let it fade into the past like so many other injustices. Luke had returned to his ranch, continuing his work, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. He wasn't sure if it was hope or just the fatigue of fighting for something that felt impossible, but the change, small as it was, felt significant. Late one afternoon, as Luke was finishing up with the cattle, he noticed a familiar figure riding toward his ranch. It was Sheriff Bradley. Luke hadn't seen him much since the incident, and his sudden appearance piqued his curiosity. As the sheriff approached, Luke set down his tools and wiped the sweat from his brow, waiting for him to speak. The sheriff dismounted and walked over, his face still carrying the weight of the past few weeks. "Luke," he said, his voice carrying a heaviness that was new. "I wanted to talk to you." Luke nodded and motioned for him to sit on the porch, offering him a seat beside him. The sheriff hesitated before sitting down, clearly gathering his thoughts. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said after a long pause. "About everything. About what happened with Ayanna, about the way I've been handling things in this town." Luke remained quiet, listening, knowing that the sheriff needed to work through his thoughts before he could truly understand what was on his mind. "I thought I was doing my job," Sheriff Bradley continued. "I thought I was protecting the town. But I see now that I've been protecting lies, hiding behind the law instead of the truth." Luke didn't respond immediately, letting the sheriff's words sink in. He could hear the regret in his voice, but Luke knew that true change wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, and it took effort. The sheriff exhaled deeply, his eyes meeting Luke's. "I want to make it right. I've been talking to the townspeople. Some of them are, well, they're still stuck in their ways, but there are others who are starting to see what we've been blind to all these years." Luke nodded slowly. "And what about Ayanna?" he asked, his voice quiet. The sheriff's expression softened. "She's gone, Luke. She's gone back to her people. But I sent word. I made sure that she knows we're trying to do better." Luke felt a twinge of sadness at the mention of Ayanna. He had hoped she might return one day, that the town might somehow make amends. But he understood. She had her own path to follow, one that didn't include this broken town. Sheriff Bradley sat in silence for a while, and Luke let him. There was nothing more to say right now. Change would come in its own time. The sheriff eventually stood, his shoulders a little less burdened. "I just wanted you to know, Luke, that I'm working on it. I'm working to make this town a place that's worth living in, for everyone." Luke stood as well, his hand resting briefly on the sheriff's shoulder. "I hope you do," he said simply. "But it's going to take all of us." The sheriff nodded, his face a mixture of determination and weariness. "I know. I won't stop trying." As Sheriff Bradley left, Luke watched him ride off into the distance. The world felt quieter, but there was a sense of something beginning to take root. Maybe it was the beginning of real change, or maybe it was just the hope that change was possible. Either way, Luke knew he had done his part. Now it was up to the rest of the town to decide if they wanted to be part of that change. Luke returned to his work, the sound of the wind whispering through the trees and the soft bleating of the cattle filling the air. There was still much to do, but for the first time in a long while, Luke felt like there was a chance, a small chance. But a chance nonetheless, for something better. Weeks passed, and life in Dusty Hollow began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but there was a noticeable shift in the town. People were talking more openly, questioning their past actions, and for the first time in a long time, some were beginning to take responsibility for their own prejudices. It wasn't easy. Change never was. But Luke could see the difference, however small it was. He had always believed that even the smallest spark could ignite something bigger, and maybe, just maybe, the first step toward healing had been taken. The town wasn't healed. Not yet. There were still whispers, still the old ways trying to cling to the edges of their lives, but Luke could feel it. The air was different now. Sheriff Bradley had kept his word. He had spoken to more people, pushed the issue of equality, and done everything in his power to make sure Ayanna's name wasn't forgotten. Luke saw the sheriff now in town, moving through the streets with a renewed sense of purpose, his posture straighter, his decisions more thoughtful. The conversations were happening, slowly, but they were happening. One afternoon, Luke decided to ride into town. He had no particular reason, just a feeling that he needed to be there. As he entered the square, he saw familiar faces, but today, they didn't seem as hostile or guarded. There was a calmness to the crowd, a gentleness in their expressions that hadn't been there before. Luke's boots clicked against the wooden sidewalk as he made his way toward the saloon. He stopped in his tracks when he noticed a group of people gathered outside. Sheriff Bradley was standing with several town members, and there was something different about the gathering. They were talking, but this time, it wasn't about blame or fear. It was about plans for the future. As Luke walked closer, he overheard a part of the conversation. "We've made some mistakes in the past," Sheriff Bradley was saying, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned from their errors. "But we're going to do better. We have to. This town isn't just for some of us. It's for all of us." Luke's chest tightened. It wasn't a grand speech, and it didn't promise everything would change overnight, but it was real. It was progress. The sheriff's words were backed by actions, and for the first time, Luke felt a glimmer of hope that the town could move forward. One of the townspeople, a woman Luke recognized from the market, nodded in agreement. "We've got to start small," she said, her voice steady. "Maybe we begin with the school. Teach the kids something different. Show them there's another way." Luke smiled to himself. Change often started with the young, with the ones who hadn't yet been taught to hate or fear. Maybe the next generation would grow up in a place where everyone was seen, where everyone was equal. The sheriff turned to Luke then, a slight nod of acknowledgement. Luke approached the group, and as he did, the townspeople shifted, parting slightly to make room for him. "Luke," the sheriff said with a small smile, "we're working on something here. Something that will hopefully make a difference." Luke nodded, but he didn't need to hear the specifics. He knew what the sheriff meant. There was a new path being carved out for Dusty Hollow, and it was one that was rooted in fairness, respect, and a willingness to listen. "I'm glad to hear it," Luke said, his voice sincere. "Just don't forget that it's a long road. It's not going to be easy." The sheriff's smile faded slightly, but there was resolve in his eyes. "I know," he said. "But I'm willing to try. We all should be." Luke's heart lifted, and for the first time since the day Ayanna had left, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for the town. The work was far from done, but this was the beginning of something that had been needed for far too long. "You're right," Luke said. "It's going to take all of us." The townspeople nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of hope and uncertainty, but there was no turning back now. They were on the right path, and the rest of the journey would unfold one step at a time. Luke turned to leave, but as he walked away, he felt something that had been missing for a long time: peace. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure how this story would end, but he knew that he had done his part. The rest was up to the people of Dusty Hollow, but for the first time, he felt confident that they could rise to the challenge. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the town, and Luke felt like he was witnessing a quiet rebirth. Dusty Hollow was changing, and it was changing for the better. Months had passed, and the changes in Dusty Hollow had become more apparent with each passing day. The sun still set behind the mountains in the same way it always had, casting a warm glow over the town, but now, the air felt different, brighter, more hopeful. The work that had begun with one act of justice had continued, not in giant leaps, but in small, steady steps. Luke Thompson had watched from the sidelines, still tending to his ranch, but now he felt a connection to the town he had once only observed from a distance. It was the first time in his life he felt that he was part of something larger, something that might actually make a difference. People had begun to reach out to one another more, their conversations no longer limited to gossip or judgment. They spoke of the future, of how they could make the town a better place for everyone. The school had started teaching lessons about the diverse cultures that had shaped their world, and the young children, who were learning with open minds, seemed to be the most eager to change the narrative. Sheriff Bradley, once a symbol of law and order defined by rigid rules, had now become a quiet leader of a more compassionate town. His efforts to bring justice to those who had been wronged, like Ayanna, had opened a door, but he knew that the work was far from done. There was still much to be done to rebuild trust, to heal wounds that had run deep for years. Luke had not seen Ayanna again, but there was a part of him that believed she had found peace. She had returned to her people, just as she had needed to, but her presence still lingered in the memories of the townspeople who had witnessed her strength, her dignity. In the weeks that followed, Luke had visited the town more often, but his life on the ranch still remained his sanctuary. He knew he had done what was right, but there was always a part of him that feared this fragile change might not last. That fear was put to rest one crisp morning when he received a visitor, someone he never thought he would see again. It was Ayanna. She had returned. She wasn't alone this time. A group of people stood behind her, their faces marked with the same strength and quiet dignity that Ayanna had shown when she had first arrived in Dusty Hollow. Luke stood still for a moment, his heart racing as he took in the sight of her. "I didn't expect to see you here again," Luke said, his voice barely a whisper. Ayanna smiled, but it was a smile of resolve, of someone who had made peace with the past and was now ready to face the future. "I didn't expect to come back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I felt like there was something here worth returning to." Luke could hear the weight in her words, the quiet strength behind them. "We've made progress," she continued. "Not just you, but the town. It's small, but I can see it. People are willing to listen, to understand. I see change in their eyes." Luke didn't know what to say. He felt both proud and humbled by her words. He had never expected any kind of acknowledgement for his actions, and yet here she was, telling him that his efforts had meant something. "The people you left behind," Ayanna said, gesturing to the group of people with her. "They're willing to work with the town. To help bridge the gap, to share what they've learned with others." Luke could feel a surge of emotion rising within him. For so long, he had felt like an outsider in this town, never quite fitting in, never quite understood. But now, with Ayanna standing before him, with these people offering their help, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could create something better together. "I'm glad you came back," Luke said, his voice steady now. Ayanna nodded, her expression softening. "I'm glad too," she said. "But this is just the beginning. There's still much to do." Luke knew she was right. There would always be more work to do. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next, ready to stand beside these people who had become his family, ready to help build something stronger, something better. As Ayanna and her group made their way to the heart of Dusty Hollow, Luke stood there for a moment longer, watching them go. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he believed that whatever it was, they could face it together. The seasons continued to shift in Dusty Hollow, each one carrying with it more evidence of the town's gradual transformation. It wasn't immediate, but over time, change took root in places where people had once refused to even look. The once rigid town square now saw more diverse faces, and the lingering air of suspicion had begun to give way to curiosity. Luke Thompson watched this transformation from the porch of his ranch, the gentle creak of his rocking chair accompanying the soft breeze that stirred the dust. The work was far from over, but the small steps taken by the people of Dusty Hollow had given him hope, hope that wasn't just fleeting, but something solid. He had made peace with the idea that change wasn't always instant, that it took time, effort, and most importantly, the willingness to face the truth. The sheriff had become a figure of quiet leadership in the town, no longer just an enforcer of laws, but an advocate for justice and fairness. He often visited Luke, the two men sitting together in the evenings, sharing stories, and discussing how to continue building bridges between the past and the future. One day, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Luke was approached by a familiar figure. It was Ayanna. She had returned once more, but this time, there was no group of people behind her. She was alone, her posture steady and confident. Luke felt his heart quicken at the sight of her. He had known that she would always carry a piece of Dusty Hollow with her, but seeing her again felt like the last puzzle piece falling into place. "You've been busy," Luke remarked, his voice light but genuine. Iona nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of determination and quiet satisfaction. "I have," she said. "But it's not just me. It's everyone." She stepped forward, standing beside Luke as they both looked out at the quiet horizon. "You've done more than you realize," she continued. "You gave us something to believe in again. Not just me, but the people who are still here, the ones who didn't give up on this town." Luke shifted in his chair, his eyes meeting hers. "It wasn't just me," he said softly. "It was all of us. The town, the sheriff, everyone who was willing to listen. We all had to change." Iona smiled, a small but knowing smile. "Yes, but you led the way. You showed them that it's never too late to make things right." Luke felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For so long, he had carried the doubts of whether he had made a difference. But standing there with Iona, he realized that it wasn't about grand gestures. It was about those small, quiet moments of standing up for what was right. "I'm proud of them," Luke said, his voice steady. "The town's starting to get it. I just hope they don't forget." Iona looked out toward the distant hills, her gaze distant but thoughtful. "They won't forget," she said softly. "But you're right. The work never ends." The conversation drifted into a comfortable silence as the two of them watched the sun sink lower in the sky. There was a peacefulness to the moment, a quiet sense of accomplishment that was shared between them. Iona finally turned back to Luke, her expression softening. "I'm going to stay here," she said. "Not just for me, but for everyone." Luke's heart skipped a beat. "Stay?" Iona nodded. "There's work to do. There's healing that still needs to happen. And I think I can help." Luke smiled, the weight of the world not quite as heavy on his shoulders anymore. "Then I'm glad you're here." Iona's presence felt like a new beginning, like the final piece of a long journey falling into place. The town was far from perfect, but as Luke looked out over the land, he knew that the future held promise. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were building something real, something that could stand the test of time. Dusty Hollow might never be free from its past, but together they would shape a future that was built on understanding, respect, and most importantly, the willingness to change. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and as the stars began to twinkle above, Luke felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Real hope. The kind that came from knowing that no matter how broken things seemed, there was always a chance to rebuild. And for the first time, Luke Thompson felt like the town of Dusty Hollow might just be on the path to doing exactly that.